Hi, welcome back to Sustaining Creation, a faith journey for small groups. We're at the final leg. We're at the last two sessions, the last two hills to climb. They're not as steep as the ones before, but the curves might get a little bit tricky. We're rounding the curve, and we can see off in the distance where we need to come. So it's a good time to pause to reflect on what we've experienced so far. What's touched our hearts along the way? What new light has come into our life? Is our soul being touched at a level that might transform us? So where are we going? In these two sessions, we're going to focus on what God is calling us to be, where God is calling us to go. And then in the last session, 4B, we're going to touch on how might we get to where God wants us to go. So it's a good time to perhaps listen at an even deeper level for what God is calling us to do in response to the climate crisis. So where should we go? Let's go back to the start of Christianity, the very first group of disciples as described by the book of Acts chapter 2, verse 44. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Radical thoughts. We all want to say that's just spiritual. That's not real. That's how they lived. Why would they live that way? They were living out how they saw Jesus calling them to live. Where would they get that idea? Let's start with the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, his very first sermon, Luke's 4th chapter. He steps up and he takes the scroll, and what he chooses from the scroll is to bring those people back to the prophet Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. To proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That's another word, another name for the Jubilee year. That's going back to the earliest roots, where in the 50th year, every 50th year, everybody was to be made whole. Everybody was to be restored. If they had been sold into slavery, they were to be freed. If they had to sell off their property because they fell into poverty, they were to be restored to that poverty. All the rich were to be made equal. Radical thoughts. And that's what God is calling us to do in a very deep way. The only way forward for a sustainable future for our kids and our grandkids is we start to value sharing at a much deeper level and at a much core value than we ever had before. We have to value and share the resources that God has given us in the new creation. We have to value and care for and hold tenderly the air, the water, the soil, the climate. Not to consume, but to care for so that future generations can live. That is what God is calling us to be. In that first disciples group, sharing all things in common, there was the necessities for life. Now in the 21st century, we have to hold the resources that God gave us in common and understand that our current way of life is destroying those. So what's God calling us to be? He's calling us, you and I, to be the people that transforms our friends and our family. They're calling us to be the people who transform our faith communities. And God is calling our church to be the society that transforms modern civilization, to be the active force in the world for a better way. God is calling us to live out that love as exemplified in that Acts 2:44 community. He's also calling us to live out that very first sermon of Jesus, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to say we've gotten it wrong. We need to make everyone whole, both those presently living, those on the other side of the globe, and those yet to be born. And the only way to do that is to change how we live. tough, tough challenge. We're going to go now to our wisdom leaders and our wisdom resources and hear their understanding of what God is calling us to be. I'll see you at the end when we wrap it all up together. Enjoy the journey.
When it comes to showing compassion, again, I think you go back to one of your earlier questions of being ego-driven, being self-centered, our universe being driven by the things that we desire and want. And instead of thinking about ourselves to the potential risk or detriment of the whole of community, to think about a good news that calls us, yes, God loves us each individually, uniquely, wonderfully made in the image of God, with God's grace and glory, children of the light, but at the same time, God makes our neighbors in that same image. Whether they're able-bodied or disabled, black, white, gay, straight, man, male, female. And Paul talks about this a lot too, that together this relationship and the love of Christ breaks down those barriers that those barriers that we create with one another, and that encourages, in terms of the cultural messages we get, encourages us to be self-centered, to have what we want, to own as much as we care to do. In fact, not to be unpatriotic, but the very essence of the American dream is to, dream big, dream often, and get what you want so that you can then retire and live comfortably. Well, that's not a goal of the gospel. And the beautiful piece of that text, and often in Luke's Gospels and the parables, are you get this insight into what he's thinking about. I'll tell myself, let me build bigger barns. And it's this self-driven greed, self-driven, I'm going to take care of me, myself, and I. And the gospel is always calling us to care for the other, care for our neighbor, care for our enemy, care for the stranger, the poor, the widow amongst you, the orphan. It is the thread that carries from Genesis to Revelation about how we are to be in community together. I would argue you can't be a Jew, a Muslim, or Christian, any part of the Abrahamic faith, without having that as a central core to what we believe and who we are. And so the positive and hopeful side of that is God reveals God's self when we empty ourselves and our servants to our brothers and sisters. When we care for our brothers and sisters, God shows up. God is there. God is present in those moments. We can see the divine in each other in many of those interactions. Not all of them, because some people are rough around the edges. But even in some of those interactions, you see that this is part of a defining thing about being created human, is a deep capacity to love like God has loved us.
Also, to extend the extravagant welcome to the communities that haven't historically been well represented here in the northwest corner of Connecticut at this camp. And so the first three were great successes. The first three retreats were great successes. We've had alumni who have come back every year and some who have decided to come to camp because of their experience at the retreat. And at that retreat, we talk about all these really heavy issues of environmental racism with respect to fossil fuel extraction and asthma rates in African American communities, for example, versus white communities because of environmental racism. And then we break up that heaviness and we go to the low ropes course, and they learn how to work together to solve problems across barriers, through different challenges. And then we come here to the garden and we learn about all the interconnectedness I was telling you about. And then they get an opportunity to plant the organic tomatoes and basil that I've grown from seed in the garden together. And most of the kids have come from urban communities, and they have said I have read on many evaluations that garden piece is so impactful and has provided a really, really unique opportunity for some, which is awesome. And at the end of each of the environmental justice retreats, everybody, including chaperones and myself, we're required to write a commitment some way, because now we know all this stuff is happening and we have a sense of how we, each of us, are responsible for part of that destruction and the injustice. And so we make a commitment on one specific action that we're going to take, because we're on the hook right now, right? Because we have this new knowledge we can't. Now God knows that we know, as the Reverend Jim Deming said once at an environmental justice retreat, you know, God knows what we know and we know what God knows, and so we're on the hook for what we do moving forward or what we don't do. So they make a commitment, and we try to follow up throughout the year. And it's a new ministry here that is it's very exciting.
For me, theologically, is the idea that God is love, and that all my theology tends to build off of that idea. And so, if God is love, then God is woven into the fabric of our daily lives, in and through love. And so. That's why I think it's important to focus on the three great loves, because when you're connected to love, you're connected to God, right? And the daily, manifestations of that in our lives. So that'd be where I begin. But how do we kind of build upon our theological basis so that our churches are reflecting that reality? I think that's the challenge that we're still living into. And so consider the second of the three great loves I mentioned, love of God's creation. I also mentioned that a lot of churches in recent times have had a tremendous disconnect from creation, right, as being part of their consciousness. And so what would a church look like that has creation consciousness, that is about creation justice? I kind of prefer that phraseology over environmental justice, because it evokes this interconnected web of creation that's about relationships with God, it's about relationships with people, it's about relationships with the broader natural world that we're a part of. And so a church that's taking creation justice, creation care seriously, what's it going to look like? Maybe churches as they are, they just can evolve in that direction. Or maybe we need to think about a new model of church, what our General Minister and President John Dorhauer talks about as Church 3.0.
I chose to work in the realm of faith and public advocacy, because I do believe that the role of government is to foster the common good, and that through Creation Justice Ministries member communions, we can reach 100,000 churches and 45 million people, and that's powerful and that's important, and all of us can change our light bulbs, and all of us can try to walk more and drive less, and all of us can try to be paperless in our meetings, and that's important, and we all need to do that work. But the truth is, we're not going to get to the level of change and innovation that we need to get to be able to see the climate progress that we need in the amount of time that we have, unless we have visionary public policy that's going to get it done. And now, in this new reality, unless we have people who will hold the line to keep the worst things from happening, so that we don't lose our climate even sooner than we already are. There are many methods, but the most important thing is persistence. Building an ongoing, respectful relationship with your congressional office, making sure that the staff members who pay attention to the climate issues that you're watching know your name, know that you're connected to a larger community, that you represent that community, and being persistent with them every time they're back home, making sure that you set up a meeting, that you go in and talk with them, ask them how they're doing on climate issues. That's what's going to change the Congress, is knowing that there's a critical mass of people whose names they know, who are watching what they're doing, and who are connected to a broader community that will not accept anything less than climate progress.
Turning to wisdom from writers. In this session, I want to introduce the words of Bill McKibben. If you have any knowledge of the climate movement at all, or activism in it, you have heard the words of Bill McKibben or seen him speaking to large crowds or being arrested in front of the White House. He's also a college professor, but at his core, he's a writer. He would tell you that he would prefer just to simply be allowed to write, but he can't because of what we've done to the world. The second book of his I want to look at, though, is Earth. And you notice he'll spells it with an extra A. And he does that to kind of be a metaphor to note that we've already changed the earth. That the earth we grew up with, that the earth we were gifted, humankind has changed. And it's never going to be the same, at least in our lifetimes, or our kids' lifetime, or even our grandkids' lifetime for that fact. But let's turn to his words. Global warming is no longer a philosophical threat, no longer a future threat, no longer a threat at all. It's our reality. We have changed the planet, changed it in ways large and fundamental. And these changes are far, far more evident in the toughest parts of the globe, where climate change is already wrecking thousands of lives daily. Where climate change is already wrecking thousands of lives daily. We're kind of insulated right now in this modern society of the Western world. But people are suffering and dying right now, and that's what Bill was talking about, that we've already wrought those changes. He goes on to say, my only real fear is that the reality described in this book, and increasingly evident in the world around us, will be for some an excuse to give up. We need just the opposite, increased engagement. Some of that engagement will be local, building the kinds of communities and economies that can withstand what's coming. And some of it must be global. We must step up the fight to keep climate change from getting even more powerfully out of control and to try to protect those people most at risk, who are almost always those who have done the least to cause this problem. The deep, deep truth is that the first people that are going to bear the cost and already are bearing the cost of the climate crisis from the pollution that we have used, to the very least, to cause this crisis. And yet they're suffering the first and the worst for it. If we listen to the gospel, we'll hear the voice of God saying, you are to take care of your neighbor. You are to live compassionately. You are to hear the cry of the widow and the orphan and of the poor and respond. We need to listen to the words and the wisdom of Bill McKibben as well as all the other authors that we're looking at. Bill is saying that we need to have local action, local community-based, but also global. And we need to get involved. In fact, he founded the organization 350.org, which I highly recommend you check out. That's where you're going to see the young people who are involved in this movement. But find an organization that can support the work that needs to be done that you can be a part of. There's a whole bunch of them out there. 350 is one of them, but there's other ones. Take the words, take the challenge of Bill McKibben to heart and work for the future of our kids. I want to spend some time exploring what Gaelic theologians refer to as thin spots. Those are the times in our life when the barriers that we put up between us and God become so thin that we can palpably sense the presence of God. Sometimes that takes a life event, a major life event, the birth of a child or the death of somebody that we are very close to, or a crisis that we encounter. Sometimes there are huge events like Paul experienced on the road to Damascus, but not necessarily so. Sometimes it's nature, a sunrise or a sunset. Sometimes it's a worship service. Sometimes it's just music. Sometimes it's poetry. It's something that touches our soul and causes a recognition that there is much more than just simply us. But there are also times where if we allow ourselves to thin that barrier, to be open, we can experience a greater understanding, a greater discernment of how God is calling us to live, to love, to act in this world. We're coming near the end of our journey. We still have another segment to go, another mountain to climb, another curve to go around, but we're at a point in our journey where, if you haven't already, you ought to pause and reflect on, is something along this journey helping to thin out the barriers so that you can sense what God is calling you to be and to do in response to the climate crisis? Maybe it's something that one of the videos exposed to you, or one of the wisdom leaders exposed to you, or one of the authors exposed to you, or maybe it's from your group dialogue and somebody has spoken something that has touched you. Maybe the way you come to it is by writing about it, or grabbing one of those books and going deeper into it, or maybe by doing one of the action items. You discern better what God is calling us to do in response to this crisis. Discerning comes about in the thin spots of life. There's a story in the first book of Samuel where the young Samuel, as a child, is apprenticed to the old prophet Eli. And during the middle of the night, Samuel hears this voice, and he thinks it's Eli, and he goes to him and he says, "Yes, Lord, I'm here. What do you need?" And Eli says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed and let me go to sleep." And that happens again and again and again. And finally, Eli realizes what's happening, and he tells Samuel, "It's God trying to speak to you. Next time it happens, just lay there and say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" That's how it works most often with me. In the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning, I come to discern how God is calling me to respond to this crisis. That doesn't mean that's how it works for you. Some people will find it in prayer, some people in action, some people in reflection. But find it we must. There's one thing I'm absolutely confident of. God's Spirit is alive and at work in this world and tugging on our hearts and our souls to respond. So quiet yourself. Create purposely thin spots so that you might hear God's Spirit calling you to act for the future of creation. Try it. Listen to wisdom, ponder anew, hear God speak. Oh, don't worry if it doesn't come right away. In my life experience, God is tenacious. He'll keep tugging at the soul and at the heart. And we won't know peace until we respond, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." So the action item I want to focus on today, out of the 6 on your list for today, is a very tough one. It challenges the core mistaken value of our society. It's number 44. And what does it say? It says, supremacy of the individual is a mistaken value of our society, and it calls on us to become a voice lifting up the needs of the community over the needs of the individual. The American society that pull yourself up by the bootstraps, go west, young man, there's always more, is centered around supremacy of the individual. And that's about as opposite of the gospel as you can get. We have elevated the individual needs, the individual desires, the individual lusts, the individual wants, so that it is held as supreme over what does the community need? What do future generations need? It's why we make heroes out of billionaires. It's the exact opposite of the gospel. And so this action item calls us to be a voice against that. To be a voice that raises up the needs of the community, particularly the needs of our kids and our grandkids, rather than the greed of individualism. We go back to the Gospel of Matthew, the 14th chapter. We get stuck with a very controversial call. It doesn't seem that way at first, but it is. It reads, when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves. Jesus said to them, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. They replied, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The first reaction of the disciples is the problem is too big. We don't have the resources. Send them away. And Jesus says, no, you feed them. That's the call to be in community. Not my individual wants and desires and lusts. What does the community need? If we're ever to tackle the climate crisis at a level and with an urgency and with a response of resources that's necessary, we're going to have to learn to say no to billionaires and multimillionaires. We're going to have to say your greed does not trump the needs of my kids and my grandkids. That's today's action item. It's a hard one to challenge this core mistaken value of modern American society. It's not about the individual. It's about what do future generations need in order to live. It's a prophetic voice. You can do this. The church can do this. We can be that voice. No, they do not need to go away. You can feed them. You can care for future generations. We can do this. So that wraps up our video session for today. What's up next is for your discussion. That's every bit as important, if not more important, than all that we laid out before you. So gather together as a group. Spend some time with the scripture, but give yourself lots of time to dialogue about what you've seen and what you've heard, what has touched you, what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. Take the time to listen very deeply to the wisdom each other shares. You never know when God is going to speak using another person's voice to give you a truth that you do not yet have. And then last but not least, in your discussion group, spend time with the 6 action items that we have in today's handout sheet. Until next time, enjoy the journey. I'm your host, Rev Dr. Terry Gallagher. See you further along the way.